And they saw the blacks as competitors for those jobs that they desperately needed. And so when they were going to be drafted into Mr. Lincoln's army, they weren't happy about risking life and limb
Yes.
to three people who were going to be their competitors economically. So that led to the draft riot of 1863 in New York. By the next year, 1864, the South, which was even more desperate for recruits than the North, resorted to actually arming slaves, which had been unthinkable up until then. But by in the last months of the Civil War, you would have seen black soldiers in gray uniforms or butternut uniforms parading on the streets of Rich, Virginia.
Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you. Welcome to the Party Pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 470. I'm talking to Fred Cookinham. He is from New York, and he was recommended to me by the great Chris Matthew Scabara. And we are going to talk about the history of New York. And it's certainly got an amazing history from going up till today, and how New York's history has shaped America, because we've certainly had some very important Americans to come from the state of New York and the city of New York. So, how are you, Fred?
I'm okay.
Hey, Fred, I do want to ask, first of all, how did you get into Ayn Rand?
When I was 11, I found Atlas Shrugged and Anthem on my older brother's bookcase. I'm not sure whether he ever waded through Atlas Shrugged, but I certainly did. I read Anthem right away when I was 11, and it was nice, but didn't change my life. But I looked at Atlas Shrugged. I looked at the cover, the back cover, the inside cover, the chapter titles, and it all looked very intriguing. But it was 2 years before I summoned up the courage to tackle that long a novel. It's 1,168 pages long. And finally, my curiosity got the better of me, and I said, "Well, look, I'll just read the first page, and I won't worry about whether I'm going to finish it." So I read the first page, and that kind of got me into the story a little bit. And so I read page two, and then page three, and just kept going. Uh, Very shortly, I began to care about the characters, and that's what you have to do if you're going to finish a long
Yeah.
novel. You want to care about the characters and be curious about them and want to learn more about them. And by the time I was halfway through the book, I thought this book is going to have quite a lot to do with the rest of my life. This is There's a lot to this book, a lot to think about. So I finished it just a week before I turned 14,
Yeah.
and I said, "Well, AYN." I didn't know how to pronounce AYN. Uh, Anne, Ain, Ein, whatever your name is, whoever you are. I just have two questions. Uh, do you really mean it? And can you prove it? And on the next page, I turned over the next page, and there was a section that said about the author, and she started out by saying, "And I mean it." So that answered question number one, but it's taken me from that day to this, and I'm 72 now, to answer the question, to answer the second question, can you prove it?
Yeah. So, well, yeah. And of course,
Taught me for a long time now.
yeah, and I looked it up. It looks like it's about 562,000 words, since there are various editions, which the page counts may vary, but the word counts generally don't. So, Fred, we're going to talk about the history of New York. So let's start. Who was in New York before 1492?
Uh, Various tribes speaking variations on the Algonquin language, or different languages in the Algonquin family of languages. And how many thousands of years they were here, I don't know. I don't know if anybody knows.
Yeah, and I don't know if they found any artifacts or anything, but yeah. So the Algonquin, is that also the Iroquois or the?
I think the Iroquois languages are also a part of the Algonquin language group, but it's confusing because sometimes you see the word Algonquin applied to various tribes or nations that were rivals of the Iroquois.
Yeah.
So it's a little confusing. And there are tribes and sub tribes or bands of a tribe in the New York City area and New Jersey and eastern Pennsylvania. The nation or tribe was called the Lenape. Up where I come from, Syracuse, New York, that was the land of what the French called the Iroquois Confederacy.
Yeah.
This was a league of five nations, and they called themselves the Haudenosaunee, which means the League of the Five Nations. And the five nations were the Seneca to the west, and then the Cayuga, and then the Onondaga in the center, and then the Oneida to the east, and then the Mohawks farther east.
Yeah, those are some yeah, and you see some of those words like Onondaga is the county where Syracuse is, and
Yes,
Oneida, yeah, and some of those other names, yeah. So, uh, so who were the first Europeans to arrive in New York? When did they arrive?
the Dutch West India Company. Um, First, it was Henry Hudson, who was sailing for another Dutch company, the Dutch East India Company,
Yeah,
who charted these waters and got a river named after him in 1611. Over the next couple of years, just the next 2 years or so, several different Dutch companies began sailing to Hudson River to buy or trap beaver pelts. Now, beaver pelts were very popular for making hats and coats. And I found out the reason for that. A beaver pelt, if it's properly cured, is waterproof.
oh,
So that was the reason, the practical reason why they were so popular in Europe. And Amsterdam in the Netherlands became the center of the beaver hat and beaver coat trade for all of Europe.
yes, and of course, the Dutch East India Company was the first joint stock company ever, and it was one of the maybe still one of the richest corporations ever. I mean,
Yeah. And it was the ownership of the stock in these companies was widespread in the Netherlands. I think of the Netherlands in the 1600s as kind of like Hong Kong is today, or before 1997 anyway. It's a small country, not a lot of natural resources. So the Dutch people have always had to live by international trade. So practically, as I have read, practically every family in the Netherlands owned stock in either the East India Company, the West India Company, or one of these other trading firms. But it would be a mistake to think of these companies as examples of free enterprise. They were examples of government policy, just government policy carried out through investor-owned companies. So it was a little more sophisticated, a little more modern, but still, basically, it was the Dutch state doing what states do, and that is war. But these trading companies were uh, tools in their wars, as well as making money for the stockholders.
yeah, that's a name certainly you see all over New York. Hudson, there's the Hudson River, of course, and then of course up in Canada there's the Hudson Bay. What can you tell us about Henry Hudson and what happened to him?
Nobody knows for
Yeah,
sure. He was English, uh, but he was an experienced sea captain, so he was hired um, by the Dutch East India Company to find a route around Scandinavia to Russia, and if possible, to China. Over the top of Russia. That never worked out, and he kept disobeying orders time and again to try to go west since he didn't have much luck trying to get east between the ice and the landmass of Siberia. He kept saying, "Well, this isn't working. Let's try the west. Let's try a northwest passage. Let's try to see if we can go around Iceland and Greenland." And that didn't work out either. But he explored far enough south that he found the mouth of the river that would be named after him, which had been explored a little bit by a French navigator named Verrazano almost a century before. But nothing, I guess, had been done by Europeans. Um, so he explored the river up as far as uh, Albany and Hudson Falls, and then he realized this is not a passage that's going to lead to China or anywhere. It's just a river. Um, but so he gave up, and then he tried again, and he got into Hudson Bay, and his crew mutinied, and they set him on a boat along with his son, and he was never seen again. There were reports by the local Inuit about a man who probably was Hudson, who lived and died, I guess, among them sometime in the 1600s.
Yeah, that was, one of the great mysteries of it. That was in 1611 that they mutinied and just, probably other people too just said, "We're gonna leave you here," and that was it. It's
Hmm.
pretty harsh thing to do, but I guess that's, you can imagine they'll probably do that in space. Probably wasn't the only time that happened. Also, what can you tell us about, Giovanni Verrazzano?
Nothing at all. I know nothing about him except that he's got a bridge named after him
Yeah.
across the strait uh, between Staten Island and Brooklyn, and that's how you enter New York Harbor.
Yeah, it's the Verrazzano Narrows Bridge. It's a really, it's a I mean, really, it's one of the truly amazing construction feats in history. Also, it's a
It was opened in 1964, and it was at that time for a few years. It was the longest suspension bridge in the world. On my walking tours, I like to point out that the two towers of the bridge, each one of which is a 70-story building in its own right, are so far apart that the engineers had to take into account the fact that they're not exactly parallel. They both are plumb. They both follow the line of gravity, but they're so far apart that there's a little curvature to the Earth's surface between them. So they're, oh, I think is maybe a foot or so farther apart at the top than they are at the bottom.
yeah, it's just amazing what some of these people done. Of course, that bridge connects Brooklyn to Staten Island, and before, you had to take a ferry across there because the
Yeah,
Verrazano Narrows is about 2 miles long, I think, or
I don't think it's 2 miles long. I'm not sure if it's even 1 mile long, but something like a.
yeah, but it's just a very wide spot where you're basically, we'll just say on one side it's the Hudson River, on the other side it's basically the Atlantic Ocean. So yeah, but but yeah, I mean, I don't know I don't know why that bridge doesn't get more acclaim as some of the other bridges because it's real. Again, it's a remarkable bridge,
Well,
remarkable feat of engineering and construction.
yeah.
Yeah, but I didn't
Uh,
want to talk about all the bridges.
New York Marathon. Uh,
Yeah.
and if you go to Staten Island and you get onto the highway behind the runners, you can walk over the bridge uh,
Mhm.
behind the runners
Yeah.
one day. There.
Yeah, that might be a good walk. Yeah, I can imagine you get some great pictures too. So 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 who were the first people who settled in New York?
Well, now that's interesting because the Netherlands was very prosperous in the 1600s, and prosperous people don't ship out to the colonies. They don't get on board a ship where they're going to be at sea for 30 to 60 days, and they don't want to go to a howling wilderness filled with what the Dutch called de wilden, the wild men. You don't do that if you're prosperous. You do that if you need a job. So
Yeah.
because the Netherlands was prosperous, a lot of people came into the Netherlands from all parts of Europe looking for a job, and if they were desperate enough, they shipped out to the colony. So most of the people in the colony of New Nederland were not Netherlandish. They were not Dutch people. They were people from all over, and 18 different languages were spoken in the colony. Now, one thing that irritates me is that tour guides and everybody else gets New Amsterdam, the capital city and main port of the colony, mixed up with the colony. It was the colony of New Nederland, New Netherlands. It's the capital city and main port was the city of New Amsterdam. The colony took up the Hudson Valley of what is now New York State and the whole state of New Jersey, too. That was the Dutch colony. But again, because the Netherlands was prosperous, the company, the West India Company, was never successful at getting many people to settle here. So even after 40 years, when the Brits took over the colony in 1664, there were only 9 or 10,000 settlers in the whole colony. And New Amsterdam, the main city, was a city of only 1,500 people, so pretty small by later standards.
And then, of course, it became New York, which I guess would be a reference to the House of York, in which was one of the one of the now it's the House of Windsor. So yeah, so that's why it's New York, and that really began really, I guess, began the tradition of cities in America being called New something, New Haven,
Oh,
New York.
Spanish were already doing that. Uh, New Spain was the name for a while for the whole area that is now Mexico to Chile, I think, or Mexico to Peru, anyway. And New France was what is now
Yeah.
Canada and the Ohio Valley.
So New York, in a lot of where has always been a multicultural city, we'll say. I mean, you talked 18 languages spoken there. How did all these people? Uh, how did all these people get along? I mean,
They
was it
got
pretty?
along fine themselves because they were all here for one reason, and that was just to make a living.
Yeah,
They wanted to all be in the fur business, which the company didn't allow for a long time, but then they finally relented. And then people could trap their own furs and sell them and buy them from the Lenape. Uh, and then when the Brits took over, this is interesting. There was no trouble between the Dutch and the British, uh, even though they were at war at the moment and the Brits took over the Dutch colony. But after that, the Dutch speaking inhabitants and the British and the English speaking uh, started right away mixing in business and social life and intermarrying. This was because they were all there just to make a
yeah,
living. This was not a nationalistic
yeah,
uh, enterprise or a religious one. Uh,
yeah.
the interesting point there is that the people who founded the New England colonies were theocrats. They were religious fanatics who demanded
Yes,
that everybody there conform to their brand of Christianity. And when the people were uh, persecuted for their religious dissent in New England, the New Nederland was the place they came to because
yeah.
the Netherlands and its possessions were the most religiously tolerant place in the world at that time.
Even more tolerant than Rhode Island.
Uh, Rhode Island,
Yeah.
well, Rhode Island uh, was founded by one of these religious fanatics, just like Massachusetts had been. And then Connecticut was founded by a man named Thomas Hooker, who had been thrown out of Rhode Island because he dissented from the Rhode Island. Uh,
Oh,
and no, he hadn't been thrown out. No, he's left because, and now that you mention it, I remember a professor of mine saying Thomas Hooker led his flock out of Rhode Island not because it was too strictly puritanical, but because God help us, it wasn't strict enough for him. These people did what religious fanatics do. I'm always trying to be more fanatical than you are. So he took his dissenting flock and started a new colony, Connecticut. Now, eventually, Rhode Island famously allowed Jews to settle.
yeah.
So we have the famous Touro synagogue, but the Dutch were way ahead on that.
Well,
The first group of Jews in all of North America settled in the Dutch colony.
hey, can you tell me a little more about those Dutch settlers and what happened with them?
Uh, well, the Jewish settlers, there had been one Jew in the Dutch colony in actually just outside of the city of New Amsterdam. Governor Stuyvesant or somebody told him, you can build a house for yourself outside the wall of the city. But in 1654, the Portuguese retook a Dutch colony that had been founded by the Portuguese and taken by the Dutch. Now the
Mhm.
Portuguese took it back. You've heard of the Spanish Inquisition. There was also a Portuguese Inquisition, and there
Yeah.
were Jewish settlers who came with the Dutch to take over the colony. It was called Pernambuco on the coast of Brazil. And now with the Portuguese back, the Jewish community decided we better get out of here before they forcibly convert us. So if there was anybody in the community with any money, they got out right away. But the ones who were left, 23 men, women, and children, they didn't have any money. So they begged passage aboard a passing French ship. And they wanted to go to Curacao, but the captain said, I'm not going to Curacao. I'm going to New Amsterdam, way up north. And they got on, and the captain said, "Once you get to New Amsterdam, you're going to have to raise some money and pay your passage." And they agreed to that. And passing through the Caribbean, they were attacked by pirates, but they made it to New Amsterdam. And the first thing the captain of the ship did was to go right to either um, Governor Stuyvesant or the municipal authorities and sue his passengers for their passage. But the people of the city of New Amsterdam voluntarily raised money to pay the passage for these Jewish compatriots of them. They were Dutch, and they got them settled. And they were allowed to settle in the city, but only at the far end of the city from Governor Stuyvesant. He lived in a big white hall on what is now called Whitehall Street, and that's probably the reason, at the southwest corner of the city. And he said to the Jews, "You can live in the northeast corner." So he wanted them as far away from him as possible, and he didn't want them there at all. But the company told him, "You leave those Jewish settlers alone. We have some of our biggest stockholders here in Amsterdam are Jewish." So they allowed to settle, but he wouldn't let them build a synagogue. They could worship in each other's houses, but he just didn't want to see any outward demonstrations of Jewishness or any dissent from the Dutch Reformed Church.
Yeah. Stuyvesant had a reputation of not being very friendly toward Jews, but I guess he was friendly to all other Christians. But, and of course, there's still,
No, he wanted nobody there but Dutch Reform. Stuyvesant was not only a career military officer with a regular army mentality, but he also had a doctorate in theology. So I can't imagine a better formula for a hard-nosed, hard-assed doctrinaire martinet than that, and that's what he was by all accounts.
what's a martinet?
Martinet is an old-fashioned term meaning a an overbearing, authoritarian military officer or somebody who acts like an overbearing military officer. Um, yeah, it's a well-known word.
And of course, you still see that name around New York a lot. I mean, most prominently, of course, Stuyvesant High School, which is very much,
Start-
an elite high school in New York. It's, up there with the Bronx School of Science, where they try to put the
Yeah,
best and
that's
brightest. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Same as all over. There's a section of Jersey City, New Jersey. Uh, uh, it has a name, and I can't think of the name of it. I think it's Bergen Square. There was a little Dutch village there called Bergen in the 1600s, and there's a very nice sculpture of Governor Stuyvesant at that square, peg leg and all.
Yeah, actually, isn't that true? I think Stuyvesant High School's nickname is actually the Peg Legs.
Peg legs, yeah.
Yeah. It's one of the you get some very unusual high school nicknames, although most of them, they're just generic names like tigers or lions, but yeah,
Yeah.
I certainly hope they hang on to that. But so, I suppose at least maybe the transition from, being a Dutch colony to an English colony, I mean, the languages are pretty similar, so I suppose that maybe made it easier. It worked out pretty well, it seems.
Oh, I don't know. Well, that wasn't the reason. Yeah, I suppose that helped. English and Dutch and modern German, Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, and Icelandic are all descended from a language called West Germanic that
Yeah.
was what was spoken in Germany in the Roman times. I guess there was an East Germanic too that died out. So yeah, they're related uh, to begin with, and centuries of trade across the North Sea have resulted in a lot of Dutchisms entering English. In Dutch, a ship is skip. So the master of a ship is a skipper. So that's where English gets the word skipper. It doesn't come from Gilligan's Island.
Yeah, skipper. Yeah. You know, the other word that I'm actually curious about too and you see this on various, I think, waterways, is the word kill. Where does that come from?
That's a Dutch word meaning a creek or a tidal inlet or estuary. And you
Yeah.
see it all over New York and New Jersey, and you don't see it in the Netherlands. It's a 17th century Dutch word that has died out in the Netherlands. According to the dictionary, the only place it's still used is in New York and New Jersey.
Yeah. So a creek is called a kill. Yeah.
Hudson, the town on the Hudson called Fishkill, and some of the animal rights activists objected to that, so thinking that it had something to do with killing fish, but it doesn't.
Yeah.
Uh, the Harlem River at one time was called the Great Kill because it's a little bigger than most kills. But
Yeah.
fish, you see the word kill all over the Hudson River uh, Valley. And
Peekskill also. Yeah. There's a town called Peekskill. Yeah.
the two straits that separate Staten Island from New Jersey are called the Arthur Kill and the Kill Van Kull.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, yeah, one of those words you just see. And it's funny how English just takes these words and uses them elsewhere. I know. So what was you know, obviously, I assume most of these people settled down on the lower end of, on the south end of Manhattan Island. Is that correct? Is that where it started, or where were they settling?
That's where the city of New Amsterdam was built around a fort, and the fort's guns looked out over the harbor. But actually, the Dutch town of Beverwijk or Beaver District, which became the city of Albany, was founded 10 years before New Amsterdam. So New Amsterdam slash New York is already the oldest major city in the United States. It's older than Boston. It's way older than Philadelphia, but Albany is still older.
Oh,
And
well,
right where downtown Albany is, that's where the fort was that the Dutch built. And again, it was to buy beaver pelts from uh, well, at that point, it would be the Mohawks.
why Albany? Was there an intersection of rivers there, or what was just that?
Yeah,
What was made them settle Albany?
uh, that's where the Mohawk River enters the Hudson River, and the Mohawk is the um, major tributary to the Hudson and provides an avenue of transportation to the west between the Appalachian chain of mountains to the south and the Adirondacks to the north.
Yeah. When did Albany become the capital?
1797. And that was partly the work of Alexander Hamilton because he was married into the Schuyler family, a uh, Dutch descending family in Albany. The Schuyler Mansion is still there, open today as a historic site.
So that was the only reason it was moved there, or it wasn't? It wasn't for.
The only reason
Yeah.
I think was this I don't know really about how that came to be, but Hamilton and everybody else at that time was expecting uh, the tide of settlement to just keep moving from New York City north up the Hudson, Lake George, and Lake Champlain valleys, and westward through the Mohawk Valley out into the Great Lakes coastal plain. Uh, Along the shores of Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, where the future cities of Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, and Utica would be built. So I guess they figured that Albany is going to be the future center of the state. Well, New York City, which had been the capital up to that time, is uh, down at one corner of the state, almost isolated from most of the state.
What was the beginning of what we now know as Wall Street?
Wall Street is where the wall was. That wall marked the northern boundary of the city of New Amsterdam. So outside of the city wall, there were farms, and then after that, woods and wilderness. Uh, and the street itself, which is Wall Street today, that was the parade ground for the Dutch burgerret citizens' right people. In other words, militia. That's where you would see the militia marching up and down and walking out through the gate in the wall to go out in the woods and have target practice. The parade ground was a uniform 80 feet wide, and it stretched from river to river, from the Hudson River to the East River, as did the wall on the north side of the parade ground. The parade ground was called in Dutch het single. Single comes from the Latin singulum, which means girdle, but I don't mean a lady's girdle. I mean a horse's girdle, the belly strap of a horse. So the wall and the parade ground that had single stretched across the island uh,
Yeah.
river to river like the belly strap of a horse. And there's a single around the city of Old Amsterdam too.
So
Uh,
so why did what when did this become the center of finance and banking and, the
uh,
Wall Street that we know today?
yeah, the center of business once the Brits took over in 1664, the center of business was the waterfront on the East River. Um, if I use can I use this map? I guess not.
No, I don't no,
Okay,
I have trouble.
well, focus on the on New Amsterdam on the south end of the island, and
Zoom back in, yeah.
you'll see that the Hudson River goes up the west side and the East River up the east side, and the waterfront developed along the East River first.
Okay.
Uh, because the tides and winds were more predictable on the East River side. So the waterfront was the center of business, and the waterfront, the shipping business, gave rise to the insurance business, and the insurance business gave rise to the banks, and the banks gave rise to the exchanges. Now, on Wall Street, closer to the waterfront, were the commodities exchanges, and then the west end of Wall Street up near Broadway, that became the site for exchanges in uh, metals, in gold and silver and stocks. And so the New York Stock Exchange was on Wall Street, but the New York Stock Exchange still has one competitor left called the American Stock Exchange, which is at the other end of Trinity Church from Wall Street. Uh, And there were others. They got consolidated out of business eventually, but there were a bunch of different stock exchanges, of which only the New York Stock Exchange and the American Stock Exchange are left today.
Didn't Amex and Nasdaq absorb the other, or
Let me see. Well, Nasdaq came about in the 1970s or 80s, and that was a few blocks south of Wall Street, on or just off Broad Street. And that moved
yeah,
up to the Times Square area. Now, that Nasdaq was the first all electronic stock exchange, but in the course of the 1980s and 90s and aughts, they all became all electronic. So this Nasdaq is no
yes.
longer unique. So that is a third stock exchange, and that's
Yeah,
up Times Square now.
Nasdaq also got the reputation for being the high-tech stock exchange, Microsoft, things like that.
I think so. Yeah.
So the English take over. So what happened in the 1700s, and anything important there, or just kind of a colony going along? And
Uh, yeah, it was held back. The colony of New York was held back a little bit by uh, a policy that the British held over from the Dutch, and that was the patroon system. Uh, the Dutch uh, at first made settlement in the colony so unattractive, and that's the other reason why people didn't want to come here and settle, because the company just made life unattractive here. You were not allowed to uh, trap your own beaver pelts or buy them from the Indians. The trapping of beaver and the buying of beaver was a protected monopoly by the West India Company. And this is why I say this was hardly an example of the free market. This was a government
yes,
protected monopoly. They were privileged. In fact, that's part of the name. It was called the GWC, the
yeah,
Geachtorde Indische Compagnie. Ge-
yeah,
ge- Geacht for whatever I just said.
yeah.
Early.
Yeah, at the time that at the time also the word corporation had a very negative connotation. Corporations are about taking rights away.
Well, this corporation was protected against competition. So at first there was a monopoly on beaver pelts, and people didn't want to settle under those conditions. Everybody wanted to go into business for himself in the colony and trap his own beaver skins or buy them from the Indians. So they changed policies from monopoly to monopsony. Instead of only one seller, only one buyer. The company said, all right, you can trap your own beaver skins, but you must sell them to the company. Well, one's just as bad as the other. And then finally, after years of this, and the colony was languishing without very many settlers, and finally the company and the government said, "Well, all right, you can trap your own beavers, and you can buy on your own account from the Indians and go into business for yourself." And then, and only then, populations start to go up. And New Amsterdam went from maybe 500 people up to 1,500 people just in time for the British to take over the whole works in 1664. Uh, but another strategy that the company and the government tried was the patroon system, a patron system, I guess you'd say in Dutch. They invited some of the richest people in Old Amsterdam to buy from the government huge tracts of land and settle them with tenant farmers. Now, that meant that the Hudson Valley from New Amsterdam to Beverwijk, that is New York to Albany, was a patchwork of huge estates, just like medieval manors. They were trying to bring back the Middle Ages. And of course, that didn't work either. Nobody wants to be a tenant farmer and have to pay part of his uh, um, bushels of crops to the landlord. So that wasn't very attractive either. Meanwhile, settling in New England was made much more attractive for the settlers because there you could be a small holding farmer and own your own land and farm it any way you wanted. And you could start a business in the cities of Boston and Providence and Hartford. So English and Welsh and Scots and Irish were flocking into the New England colonies, which meant that the colony's religious leadership couldn't possibly get away with being as strict about religion as they used to be. Now that all these Scots Presbyterians and Scotch Irish Presbyterians were flooding into the colonies, but it made them very prosperous compared with New York. Uh, the patroon system lasted until the 1820s or 30s when there was a protest movement of the tenant farmers, which resulted in some violence. This incident was called the Rent Wars, and some of my ancestors were involved in the Hudson Valley. And the governor of New York, now this is the 1820s, it's the state of New York in the United States. The governor of New York said, however much money the tenants have paid in rent so far, that is now considered a sale. That is now considered payment to the patroon for the land, and those farmers now own their land. The biggest patroon, and the only one who was successful, was the um, Van Rensselaer family. Kilian Van Rensselaer never came to see his possessions in the New World. He just stayed on the Dam in Amsterdam counting his money, but he sent out managers and surveyors to survey his land and manage the tenant farmers on it. Today, look at a map of the counties of New York State, and you'll see Albany County west of the Hudson and Rensselaer County east of the Hudson. Those two counties together made up Rensselaerwijk, Rensselaer's district. Descendants of Kilian van Rensselaer did settle on that land, and one of them was Stephen van Rensselaer, whose wife was Peggy Schuyler, the third of the three Schuyler sisters, from the Hamilton musical. And he's the one who had to, I think, was the one who had to relinquish ownership of his land or part of his land to the tenant farmers, and they could become smallholding farmers at last. Uh, and that made living a little better for the farmers in the Hudson Valley. But that was happening at the same time as the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825. Now, up until that time, skippers, ship's captains sailing between Britain or the Netherlands and the colony of New York or the state of New York, or all the states, prefer to put in at Boston rather than New York because Boston is 200 miles farther east than New York and therefore 200 miles closer to Europe. But in 1825, with the opening of the Erie Canal, all of a sudden, New York became the attractive shipping point because it's not only an ocean port on New York Harbor, but it's also a river port on the Hudson and now the Mohawk, the canalized Mohawk River, and the Erie Canal was opening up shipment from Albany up 100 miles up the Mohawk River to Utica, and then another 200 miles to Syracuse, Rochester, and Buffalo on Lake Erie. So the Erie Canal was a New York State project. It cost a huge amount of money initially for the taxpayers of New York State, but it paid off. It was the right project at the right place at the right time. The New York State was hoping to make back that initial investment in 10 years. They made it back in 10 months.
Wow. I also assume Rensselaer, some of that land probably became the college known as RPI.
Sure, that's named after him, and that's in Rensselaer County in the city of Troy.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're getting up to the what was New York? What was going on in New York in the pre-revolutionary times? When were there starting to be some inklings for independence there, or some movement for independence there?
Here, I'm going to echo something that John Adams said, and I think a lot of other people have said it. Adams, in his later years, said there is no, and I think Benjamin Rush or somebody else said the same thing. He said there is no more common mistake than to confuse the American Revolution with the War for Independence.
No.
Uh, the Revolution started in 1765 with the Stamp Act crisis. That crisis was the first act of the revolution. The Stamp Act crisis caused a lot of agitation, a lot of trouble in 1765, but then Parliament repealed the Stamp Act and things quieted down. But they didn't quiet down altogether because now a lot of people had had a little taste of revolutionary politics and they were thinking, we could get more concessions as we got a concession on the stamp issue. But then in the Parliament, in its wisdom, passed more oppressive acts, um, which caused more trouble. And I can't think of the name of those acts, but then that caused another surge.
The
Uh,
intolerable acts. There were lots of different names for them. Yeah.
yeah. See, Stamp Act. Well, the one in the middle. Anyway, 1770, and that resulted in the Boston Massacre and the occupation of Boston by redcoats. But then most of those acts were repealed, except for the Tea Act, and the Tea uh, Act then caused a third upsurge in revolutionary activity, resulting in the Boston Tea Party of 1773, and then after that, uh, the whole year 1774 was one of tea parties up and down the coast. It wasn't just Boston that had a tea party. New York had a tea party, and all the other port cities, wherever British tea ships tried to, from Boston in December of 73 through all of 74, those tea shipments were either dumped or burned. So things got more and more out of hand. And then finally, in April of 75, uh, organized fighting started and the war was on. The way I see it and the way I talk about it on my tours is that I speak of the American Revolution as the Revolutionary Era, beginning in 1765 and going on in a way all the way to 1801, because the word revolution means one full term. And in those years, 1765 to 1801, you go from stable royal government to revolutionary trouble, and then to outright war, and then to the establishment of a new nation and a new constitution, and the testing of that constitution by the peaceful transfer of power from one president to another, Washington to Adams, but then the harder test, a transfer of power from a president of one party to a president of the other party, namely from Adams to Jefferson. And when Jefferson peacefully took office as president in 1801, you could say that was the completion of one full turn from stability to instability and back to stability again. So that's the American Revolution, that whole era. The War for Independence, first of all, was the Revolutionary War. And for the first year, you could call it just the Revolutionary War from the Battle of Lexington in 75 up through July 4th, 1776, when Congress announces we have seceded from the British Empire. These colonies are absolved of all allegiance to King George III. We are a new nation, a republic. And now it was a war between one nation and another nation, in spite of the fact that one of those nations didn't recognize the existence of the other nation as a nation. But nevertheless, they got used to the idea. And then you can call it the War for Independence. Um, so that's how I see it. But people, including tour guides and even historians, every day they're saying the American Revolution when they mean the War for Independence and vice versa. So that's a big annoyance to me. And it just makes it more confusing for the students, too.
Yes, it does. I should ask also, who was Jacob Leisler?
Jacob Leisler was a German settler in the colony of New York in 1692 who was appointed lieutenant governor by the royal governor. And which one was he? Can't think of his name, but the governor. Oh, England had a revolution in 1689. It became known as the Glorious Revolution.
Glorious Revolution. Yes, the removal of the removal of the Catholic James and the
Yeah.
reign of William and Mary, who, of course,
Mm,
and that was the end of any Catholic influence in England. Of course,
yeah.
there's also a college, and also the second oldest college in America is named for William and Mary. But yes,
Indeed. The governor said to Leisler, his lieutenant governor, I'm going back to London to find out who's in charge and who I need to be sucking up to. And I may be gone for many months. So you are acting governor now. So the governor went away to London, and Jacob Leisler became acting governor for a year or two, I think it was, before the governor came back. And when he came back, Leisler was denounced by I think it was one of the members of the Bayard family. Now, Bayard, that's a French name, so these were Huguenots. Another example of how people who were religious dissenters in other countries came to the Dutch colony and the post Dutch British colony if they wanted to be free to practice their religion. So the Bayards were a Huguenot family. Uh, but since they went back to Dutch times, Washington Irving would have called them Knickerbockers, which was his nickname for the descendants of the Dutch settlers. One of the Bayards denounced Leisler as a usurper who had done something, supposedly usurping the governor's powers. And Leisler, of course, said, well, the governor left me in charge as acting governor, so there shouldn't be any trouble. But the governor apparently agreed with Bayard, so he had Leisler hanged. Uh, Leisler has a statue, very nice sculpture up in New Rochelle, uh, I think.
yes,
What else do I know? Leisler came from Frankfurt in Germany, and so that's why there's a Frankfurt street right alongside the Brooklyn Bridge.
and of course, New Rochelle is also the home of the Thomas Paine Cottage. What were the relations like with the indigenous Americans here, the various tribes, with the colonists? Were they pretty good? Were they bad? Or
They had good times and bad times. The thing to remember about the Dutch colonists, remember I said the company had trouble getting anybody to settle. They couldn't get very many Dutch settlers to settle in the colony. Because of that, the Dutch never, in the 40 years of the existence of the colony, they never had enough people to outnumber their own internal Indians. And so the Dutch had to watch their step because the Indians were numerous enough that they could have wiped them out. Uh, the Dutch governors uh, blundered stupidly into 3 or 4 wars with the local Indians, and a lot of Dutch settlers did get killed um, unnecessarily because these wars could have been prevented with a little diplomacy. By the early 1700s, there were still Indians living on Manhattan Island. Of course, the city was only starting to grow any farther north than the wall. The wall was taken down and new streets were laid out, but only up to Canal Street or so, not even that far. So there were still some Indians living on the island. And finally, one of the British governors paid the last Indians to leave Manhattan Island. And so they moved out to New Jersey. Um, and there were a lot of slaves who escaped. I don't know about a lot, but there were some slaves who escaped from their masters and intermarried with the local Indians. So that today on Long Island, there are 2 small Indian reservations. One is called Shinnecock, and it's across the bay from Southampton, where the rich folks live, and an even smaller one called Puspatuck. And
Mhm.
that is the smallest Indian reservation in the United States. And everybody who lives there is black. They don't look like Indians. They look like black Africans. And it's
Oh,
because of the runaway slaves intermarrying with the local Indians in such numbers that their descendants all look black now.
what was this situation with slavery in New York?
Dutch slavery was much uh, less harsh than British slavery. A Dutch slave could sue his master and he could own land himself. So it was more like indentured servitude. Now, every case of slavery is different because the laws are different in each nation and even each colony or province. So it wasn't nearly as bad for the slaves legally under the Dutch as it would become under the British. And once the British took over in 1664, the laws pertaining to slavery throughout the 13 colonies got harsher and harsher and harsher, especially in the South, of course, where there was simply more slaves. Um, oh, uh, and the slave was reduced from being something like an indentured servant down to being purely an owned object, chattel slavery. You were owned just as your master would own his cows and his horses and his dogs. So it got worse and worse.
So when did some abolitionist movements start? I don't think Hamilton was ever really pro-slavery, right?
No, he was opposed to slavery and also opposed to abuse of the Indians too. The In President Washington's farewell address, which was drafted by Hamilton, Washington and Hamilton say that honest dealings with the Indians is the only policy that will reflect luster on our new republic. Those lines were written by Hamilton. Uh, in Outside of Utica, New York, there's a village called Clinton, named after George Clinton, the first elected governor of New York. And in Clinton is Hamilton College, which was founded in Hamilton's lifetime by Reverend Kirkland and I can never remember whether he was a Presbyterian or Church of England or Episcopalian, but he was the prophet, the Christian prophet or apostle to the Mohawk or to the Oneida Indians. And it was because of his influence that the Oneidas were the only one of the 5 nations to ally with the Americans during the Revolutionary War. And he caused there to be years and years of pretty good relations with the Oneidas. Uh, and he and whoever else was involved in founding the college, it was not just a college, but a high school and I guess a elementary and middle school too for a while. and it was meant to be a place where the settlers' children and the Oneida children could learn and study together and learn English and the Oneida language. Uh, and so Hamilton was a leader in improved relations between settlers and Indians. He was, I forget whether he owned slaves himself at some point. But John Adams was the only one of the founders who never in his whole life owned a slave on principle. Uh, that whole era, the whole Revolutionary era, was also the era of the beginning of the anti-slavery movement. And this was part of the general intellectual movement of the Enlightenment that took place in the American colonies and Britain and France and other places in the 1700s. It was the Quakers, the Society of Friends, who were way out ahead of everybody on the slavery issue. As early as 1713, I think it was, the Quakers were coming out publicly for the abolition of slavery. And by the time the revolution got heating up, the Society of Friends leadership was sending out an ultimatum to their members in the colonies and in England. You must divest yourself of your slaves, or we will kick you out of the Society of Friends. And so they were pioneers in
and
the slavery movement.
and
The,
they were mostly in Philadelphia, yeah, or
uh,
Pennsylvania, yeah.
yeah, I don't know where exactly they were. New York did have a Quaker meeting house. Um, and where else they were and how great numbers, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. So, how did New Jersey become separate?
The same thing happened to the colony of New Jersey as happened to the colony of Carolina. There were no roads at all from one end of the colony to the other. And so the king sent out two governors uh, to govern two halves of each colony. And so there came to be a North Carolina and a South Carolina as separate colonies. And the same thing happened to New Jersey. As small as New Jersey is, there were no roads at all for a long time between the landing places on the Hudson and New York Harbor and the Arthur Kill and the Kilvan Cull and the Hackensack River and uh, the yeah, what's the other one beginning with P? River on the east side of New Jersey and the Delaware River on the west side. So for a while, it was ruled as two separate colonies, East Jersey and West Jersey. Uh,
Yeah,
or nuts. What's the name of the other river? It begins with P.
but eventually became New Jersey. Yeah,
Yeah, eventually they were united
yeah,
into one colony. Connecticut too. Connecticut also started as two separate colonies. New Haven was one
yeah.
colony, and Connecticut around the Hartford area was the other. But eventually they were combined.
So when and I've also heard too that apparently the Confederation Constitution. Some say that the U.S. Constitution was actually modeled on that.
Modeled on what?
The con the Constitution of the Algonquin tribes, or those 5 tribes.
Oh, the Iroquois.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard that. I don't know the facts, but uh, I've heard advocates for the Iroquois say the U.S. Constitution is modeled on the Iroquois Confederacy. I've heard Presbyterians say the U.S. Constitution is modeled on the Constitution of the Presbyterian Church. And I think I've heard three or four other similar claims.
Yeah.
The framers of the Constitution were, some of them anyway, were constitutional experts. They had studied the constitutions of the city states of ancient Greece and Rome and medieval Venice and other examples of republics, and the Iroquois and the different churches like the
Mm,
Presbyterian Church. So they probably took ideas from all kinds of different sources.
I can imagine. So what was going on in New York, when the, shooting began, say, in 1774, 1775?
Well, like I said, New York had its own Tea Party,
Mm,
and I showed that on one of my tours at the foot of Wall Street on the East River. There was a ship with a small number of chests of tea, and those tea chests were the tea was dumped into the water, and the chests were burned in a bonfire. And the captain of the ship was forced to apologize for bringing the tea and to promise to never bring any more tea. But there was another, a far bigger ship out in the Narrows that saw what was happening to the first ship, and they didn't even try to enter the harbor at all. They were under orders: if you can't land the tea in New York, proceed to Halifax. I was surprised to find that there was at least a little bit of a movement for independence in Nova Scotia, and maybe I don't know about New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island and Quebec. There was some movement toward independence that just didn't get very far because there weren't
Yeah.
enough people in Canada, and those who were there were only there to supply the British Army and Navy, so they weren't going to bite the hand that fed them.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and of course, there were really 28 colonies, I think, so, in the Western Hemisphere, not just the 13 that we know now. Think of in America, but yes. So after, what was the sentiment? Were New Yorkers in favor of the revolution, or were they pretty much? I've often heard, that overall it was about one third Tories, one third independents, and one third just didn't care.
Yeah. First of all, another correction that I want to pass on to your listeners about terminology. Uh, there were a lot of people who were against the revolution, against independence. But if you ask them, are you a Tory? They would say, no, I'm not a Tory. I'm a Whig, which means I'm willing to criticize the king. But independence, no, that's going too far. So that kind of person called himself a loyal Whig. And a lot of people fell into that category. So the word Tory is a little misleading. New York was not as hot for revolution as some of the other colonies. A lot of it had to do with how far inland you lived. If you were a shipper in New York or any other port city, you depended on trade with Britain, which means you depended on the protection given your ships by the British Navy. So you were less likely to be a rebel on that account. If you lived farther inland, you were a farmer, whether big or small, and you lived off the land. And to you, the king and parliament were distant annoyances who only wanted to tax you and regulate you. And so you were more likely to be pro independence. If you had money and you lived in the port cities, you were more likely to be a member of the COE, the Church of England, and that meant that you got to go to church with the governor. And so at Trinity Church on Broadway at Wall Street, the people there tended to have money and they tended to be known personally by the governor. And after church, they might uh, tug on the sleeve of the governor and ask a favor of him. So that culture of sucking up to your superiors in the imperial system was more likely to make you a loyalist. Uh, if you did not have money, you were more likely to be a Presbyterian and therefore a Scot. And you might have, or your father might have fought for Scottish independence at the Battle of Culloden in 1745. The number 45 was very important to the revolutionaries because that brought memories of the rebellion of Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Scots against William of Northumberland, who was the victor at the Battle of Culloden. Uh, After that battle, somebody in England named a flower. Again, the culture of sucking up to people with royal titles, noble titles. Somebody developed a flower that he called Sweet William in honor of William of Northumberland, while the Scots named a weed Stinking Billy for the same for the same reason. Uh, Scott's background, Presbyterian church, not so rich, living farther inland, being a farmer, that made you more likely to be pro-independence. And remember, at the time of independence, 19 out of 20 Americans were farmers.
Mhm. Yeah, 19 out of 20 Americans were farmers. So, what are some other interesting things you can tell me about Alexander Hamilton? I mean, he's a famous person from New York at the time.
Yeah, he's interesting in being an immigrant, somebody who came from outside of the borders of what is now the United States, came from the West Indies, came from nothing, came from a single mom and an impoverished family, um, and advanced by his brilliance. In the West Indies, he came to the notice of a local Presbyterian clergyman who wrote a letter of introduction for young Alex to the College of the King's College in New York and Princeton, which was then called the College of New Jersey and was a Presbyterian college. Uh, he once he was here, uh, the first people Hamilton met were the owners of the shipping company that he had worked for in the West Indies, and that was the firm of uh, Courtwright and the other guy. Courtwright, that's another Dutch name, another Dutch
Yeah.
family, Barker family. So through them, he met his lifelong friend Hercules Mulligan. And then he went out to New Jersey, to Princeton, and applied as a student at the College of New Jersey, which is today Princeton University. And he was turned down because being a smart, cocky, ambitious young kid, he insisted on being admitted as a sophomore, not as a freshman. He wanted to skip the first year. And the president of the college said, no, we don't do that. We're not going to let you finish in 3 years because our college it does more than just teach you stuff. We make a proper Presbyterian gentleman out of you, and that doesn't can't be done in 3 years. It takes four. So no, we're not going to admit
Yes.
sophomore. So young Hamilton went over to New York to Plan B, to his set his backup, his safety college, which was the College of New York. It is now Columbia University.
Yes.
And there he got admitted. Uh, Never mind 3 years. He finished in less than 1 year. He just read his way through the curriculum in a few months. He had also done the same thing in high school because he wasn't even old enough to graduate high school when he got here. So he enrolled at a high school in Elizabeth, New Jersey, when he went through 4 years of high school in a few months. Then he went four
Yeah.
years of college in a few months. It was in Elizabeth, New Jersey that he would have met young Aaron Burr, and they began their long story together.
It's really amazing how, young men, maybe 13 or 14, they really were expected to be men. I mean, they
Yeah,
went to they traveled on their own and all this stuff, and it's really, really amazing, and and this is part of what really made America America was the first country, of truly of self-made men, and you
yeah.
could get poor and work your way up, and
Well, Ayn Rand used to say that Americans coined the expression to make money.
yeah,
That is to create new wealth, not just move it around, but to create new wealth. I've always wondered whether that's true. Um, but perhaps it's partly true. I'm sure somebody in the history of the world must have spoken about the concept of creating new wealth that didn't exist before. But it became part of the American culture, to be sure. Um, oh, what else? And Hamilton certainly was that. He certainly was a self-made man. He didn't inherit any money. He lived on a paycheck his whole life. Um,
yeah.
uh, so yeah, no silver spoon for Hamilton.
Well, we could certainly say the same thing for old Ben and Benjamin Franklin, that is. I mean,
Yeah, he didn't come from money. He was an apprentice as a boy to his older brother James, who ran a newspaper, uh, and he hated his brother and ran away from the indenture and ran away from Boston. Boston was Franklin's hometown. On my tours, I show number 81 Pearl Street, where there's a plaque that says that this was the location about the year 1700 of the print shop, the very first print shop in New York. New York's whole long history of printing and publishing begins right
Yes.
at 81 Pearl Street with William Bradford. And I can show you his gravestone at Trinity Churchyard. He was the royal official government printer for New York for the very good reason that he was the only printer in New York for a long time. So young Franklin showed up on his doorstep and he said, I'm an experienced assistant printer and I need a job. And Bradford said, well, sorry, Master Franklin, I don't have any openings right now, but try my son in Philadelphia. He has a print shop too.
Mhm.
So Franklin went on to Philadelphia. That is fascinating because that's one of the great might-have-beens of American history. If William Bradford had had work for young Franklin that day, then all the subsequent history we know so well about Franklin and Philadelphia might have happened here in New York.
Yeah. Franklin, and yeah, I didn't really, I did was gonna ask, the history of, New York publishing, I mean, with books and stuff, it just became the center, for all of that. Random House and Simon and Schuster, they're all based in New York City.
Yeah. Not that there aren't publishers in other parts
Yeah.
of the country, but the big ones have been in New York. And again, the publishing and show business and other things followed the money. They followed the stock exchanges and the banks that followed the insurance companies that followed the harbor.
Okay, so now the Revolutionary War is over. What happens in New York after that? I mean, we've
New
pretty
York
much
occupied
close.
city
Yeah.
in ruins for the 7 years of the British occupation. The British took the city in 1776, early in the war, and they held it until the very last day of the war, November 25th, 1783. That's the day the British evacuated New York. And as far as military operations on land in the former colonies, that was it. That was the end, the last of the British redcoats on these shores. If we were in New York on that day, we could follow the last British Guard detail marching down Broadway and then down Wall Street to Murray's Wharf at the foot of Wall Street on the East River. And we could have watched them get into their launches and row out to their transport ships in the harbor and then sail away. Evacuation Day, November 25th, was celebrated as a holiday in New York City and vicinity for over 100 years after that. It was a bigger event than Independence Day. Uh, with the end of the British occupation, New York came back to life. About one-fifth of the city had burned down on the night of September 20th, 1776. And so there were burnt ruins that didn't get rebuilt. Most of the people in the city had fled in the early part of 1776 on the advice of General Washington, who had posters put up that said, "Your city is about to become a battleground. If I were you, I'd get out of here." And they did. But then during the 7 years of occupation, loyalists were coming into the city from other parts of the 13 colonies, seeking the protection of the British flag, and slaves were escaping their American masters and coming into New York City for the same reason. So it's kind of hard to keep track of how many people there were in the city from month to month from during the war. But at the end of the war, November of '83. And then the other thing is the British closed the port. Now, how are you going to make a living in a port city if the port is closed? And there were ships sitting in the East River at the in their docks, loaded with goods bound for England or someplace else, and they weren't allowed to leave for 7 years. So at the end of the occupation, they were finally able to leave. People came into New York. The garbage hadn't been collected for 7 years. People were tearing all down the fences to use for firewood. All the trees on the island had been cut down by the redcoats and the Hessians for huts and for firewood. Uh, there had been a steam pump or some kind of a pump that was used to pump water into a primitive municipal water system that broke down and was never fixed for 7 years. Uh, the place was a mess. So with the end of the occupation, New York came back to life, and the population started zooming skyward. Uh, well, they thought it was zooming for a while, but they ain't seen nothing yet, because with the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, after that, for the next 100 years, the population of New York City was doubling every 20 years. So New York not just came back to life, but became, some like to say, the capital of the world in the 20th century.
Yeah, certainly it did. It became the center of finance. So, so our first, so after Hamilton, I guess the most prominent New Yorker would have been Van Buren. He's what can you tell us about Martin Van Buren? He was the first president from the state of New York.
Yeah. Don't know much about him. He came from a town just south of Albany in the Hudson Valley called Kinderhook. Now, hook, along with kill. These are good Dutch words to know, studying New York's history. Hoek means a cape, a little bit of land that sticks out into the
Yeah,
water.
yeah, Cape, yeah.
So hoek, Hoek in Dutch becomes hook,
Yes.
Hook in English, but that's what it means. So Kinderhook, and Kinder means children. I don't know how that figures, but that's the name of the town. Some say that's where we get the word okay from, because his nickname was Old Kinderhook, and apparently somebody, either the president himself or somebody, was putting
Yeah.
okay, initials okay on documents because they had been signed and approved by President Old Kinderhook. At least that's one theory where the word okay comes from.
Yeah, he's okay, yeah.
uh, so let me see. Well, it's a Van name. He's of Dutch ancestry, but I don't know much of anything about him. Never been to his
You know,
birthplace.
also so speaking of okay, but where does the word Yankee come from?
Ah, that's another good one. And again, the origins of things are usually not known, because nobody knows when an expression is first coined that it's going to be famous one day. So they
Yeah.
don't usually write down how it was coined, or by whom, or where, or when. But here's a possibility. The Dutch policies in colonization were influenced by a Dutch legal theorist, and again, his name escapes me, who wrote, and this was about the year 1600, who wrote that if you don't use something, then such as land, then you don't have a very good claim to ownership of it. So the Dutch policy and the Dutch West India Company's policy was, we're not going to claim huge tracts of land. We're going to claim as much land as we think we can get people into to settle. And as I've said, they weren't successful even at that. So the original plan for the Dutch colony of New Nederland was to claim everything from the Delaware River on the west to the Connecticut River on the east, which means that the Hudson River, right smack in the middle, would become the center of settlement. Uh, After a few years, though, they weren't getting anybody but a tiny handful of settlers on the Connecticut River in what is now the state of Connecticut. So Governor Stuyvesant sat down with the governor of the British colony of Connecticut, and he negotiated a pullback of the border between their two colonies from the Connecticut River westward to where the state line is now between New York State and Connecticut. So whenever you look at that boundary between New York and Connecticut, think of Peter Stuyvesant. That's one of the reasons why historians call him the first great New Yorker, because he left that mark on the maps,
Yeah.
the boundary between the colonies. Well, then he had to tell the few Dutch colonists east of that line that you are no longer in New Nederland. The land you're settling is now going to be part of the British colony of Connecticut. And so you are going to have to either become naturalized UK citizens and subjects of the British king, or else you're going to have to move westward so that you're within the colony of New Nederland still. And those people, those few people moving into the Hudson Valley from the Connecticut Valley, uh, got to be called Yankees, either because there was a settler named Jan Keys
Yeah.
or some similar reason. But that is thought to be uh, probably the very, very, very origin of the term. But then the word Yankee then came to mean somebody from Connecticut, as in Mark Twain's novel Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. And then it came to mean anybody from New England. And then during the Civil War, Yankee came to mean anybody from north of the Mason-Dixon line. And then in the 20th century, Yankee came to mean anybody from the United States. So, for example, in 1968, George Wallace, governor of Alabama, was running for president. And when you do that, you have to take a much publicized trip abroad in order to pretend that you know something about foreign policy. So, Wallace took a trip to the Philippines. And as Americans were in the 1960s, he was confronted with signs saying, Yankee, go home. And Wallace said, I don't know who they're talking about. I'm from Alabama.
Yeah. Oh, even today, don't call those people Yankees. Absolutely not. Yeah. Alabama or South Carolina or yeah, that is it's one of those very interesting words. So moving on, we can go through the 1800s and there was all this growth and then what happened and New York also very much became a landing point for immigrants, correct?
Yeah, so did every other port in the United States, but New York, and again, it's because of the Erie Canal um, and the opening up of manufacturing mainly along the Erie Canal. Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Utica, Albany became manufacturing cities, and manufacturing needs large amounts or large numbers of workers, factory workers, and so, on top of the boom in land in New York State along the canal, in the after 1825, now you had huge numbers of immigrants coming from all over Europe and then all over the world to the manufacturing cities to build the railroads and work in the steel plants and textile mills and every other form of industry. And New York State just grew and grew and grew in economic importance. Um, and here we are.
When did New York abolish slavery?
Well, in New York State and New York City, everything is always more complicated than it would be anyplace else. So the law abolishing slavery in New York State was passed around the year 1800, but it wouldn't fully go into effect until 1825. So the slave owners had lots of time to gradually ease themselves out of the slave business. And it was done gradually. I think it was a male slave was freed immediately, but the female slave remained a slave for a certain number of years, or her children remained a slave for a certain number of years, or something. But it was very slow and gradual. So it was 1826, I think, before the last slaves were freed in New York State officially. And they had a big parade on Broadway celebrating the fact on Independence Day, July 4th, 1826, 50 years after the Declaration of Independence, the slaves in New York were able to celebrate their freedom. There were only a few hundred left by that time. Anyway, a lot of slaves had gotten freed during the Revolutionary War by the simple expedient of simply running off. And I suppose slaves have probably always done that throughout history. You take advantage of the confusion of war to simply clear out, escape.
So, we had one bit major event in New York, of course, with the draft riots. What happened in New York during the Civil War? What can you tell us about that?
New York City uh, didn't get behind the Civil War very much because it had economic ties to the south. Even in Dutch times, the 1500s, if you grew cotton in Virginia or the Carolinas, you would ship it by a coastwise ship up to New Amsterdam for a uh, loading into an ocean-going vessel and sailing under the Dutch flag to Amsterdam, and then later to the British ports for the making of cotton into finished clothing in the Lancashire mills. And southern planters who had money during the unbearably hot summer months in the South, they would come up to vacation in the cool, breezy North. And so, of all places, Staten Island became a big resort for Southerners. And so there were family ties uh, and business ties from Staten Island to the South. Cornelius Vanderbilt grew up on Staten Island, another Dutch name, Vanderbilt. And he had two wives. I think his first wife died, and he married another one, and she was a Southern belle. She was the daughter of some plantation owners. The plantation owners, being defeated in the Civil War, often had only one asset left they could sell, and that was their daughters. So a lot of, I don't know how many, but some Southern planters married off their daughters to Northern business magnates. Also, Saratoga Springs was becoming a spa and a vacation spot in the movie Gone with the Wind. You hear one of the Southern
Yes.
girls talk about those Yankee girls we saw last summer up in Saratoga.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Vanderbilt was at New Yorker his whole life. Yeah,
Yes. Also,
Cornelius.
these another factor here was the Irish potato famine of the 1840s.
Oh
That was
yes,
creating for huge numbers of starving Irishmen to come to Boston and New York and other cities, uh, desperately looking for work, sometimes starving to death on the ship before they got here. Uh, and They were competing against freed slaves for the lowest kind of jobs, like digging out cesspools, digging out outhouses. Uh, and they saw the blacks as competitors for those jobs that they desperately needed. And so when they were going to be drafted into Mr. Lincoln's army, they weren't happy about risking life and limb to
yes.
treat people who were going to be their competitors economically. So that led to the draft riot of 1863 in New York. By the next year, 1864, the South, which was even more desperate for recruits than the North, resorted to actually arming slaves, which had been unthinkable up until then. But by in the last months of the Civil War, you would have seen black soldiers in gray uniforms or butternut uniforms parading on the streets of Richmond, Virginia. Uh,
Yeah, yeah, you're not the first person who's told me about that, because for a lot of people in the South, it wasn't necessarily about slavery. It was just about we do not trust the federal government and we want to leave.
well, it was about slavery.
Yeah,
Uh,
well, and tariffs, but yeah.
they could they could they could bring other issues into it after the fact, but it was about slavery. When Eliza is uh, crossing the ice flows of the Ohio River to escape from Kentucky into Ohio, I don't think she was saying anything to herself about Lawsy. I've got to get up to the north, the land of high tariffs and protectionism. She was trying to get out of slavery. It was about slavery.
So from there, can you tell us anything about Grover Cleveland?
Grover Cleveland. Well, my libertarian friend Jim Ostrowski in Buffalo is a big fan of Grover Cleveland. Uh,
So is Dr. Lawrence Reed, the former president of the Foundation for Economic Education. But yes.
Grover Cleveland came from New Jersey originally and moved to Buffalo. It was in Utica for a while, and then Buffalo, and then got himself elected as mayor and cleaned up Buffalo, which was no mean feat, and then got himself elected a reformed governor of New York. and then went from there to being the Democratic candidate for president. Uh, uh, there is a connection to my family history about that. My great grandfather, Henry J. Cookinham, was a big lawyer for many years in Utica. He started his legal career as an apprentice lawyer in the Utica law office of Roscoe Conkling, Senator Roscoe Conkling. Um, now, uh, Conkling was the head of one faction of the Republican Party. After the Civil War, for the next 50 or 60 years, the Republican Party was pretty much dominant in national politics. And whoever the Republican Party nominated for president was pretty well assured of becoming president. The other faction of the Republican Party was headed by Senator James G. Blaine of the state of Maine.
Yes.
Conkling and Blaine hated each other and couldn't agree on anything. Uh, and then Blaine, over Conkling's objectives, got nominated for president in 1884. And Conkling, as my great grandfather tells the story, uh, Conkling pulled all the strings he could find and pulled in all his political debts and leaned on all his political allies and followers to vote for the Democrat, Grover Cleveland, just to keep his hated rival Blaine out of the White House. And he was successful.
Mhm.
So a funny story about that, in a certain um, hotel uh, in Midtown Manhattan, and I've heard two different stories, two different hotels, but there was a rally for Blaine. And one of the speakers was a certain clergyman, a Reverend Berkshire, who gave a speech on Blaine's behalf, putting down the Democratic Party as the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion. Rum and
Yeah.
Romanism meaning the Irish, the hated Irish immigrants.
Yeah, there was the anti-Irish prejudice in this country was just amazing. It's amazing to think that it's almost non-existent now.
Yeah. And
In fact, if I have a prejudice, I love the Irish. I like to think of them as honorary Americans. Just
well, I think I would agree with you on that because she married an Irishman named Charles Francis O'Connor, who went by the name of Frank all his life. And her hero, Howard Rourke. Rourke is an Irish name, a couple of other Irish names,
oh yeah,
Irish fiction, or Scots. Taggart is a Scottish name. And Galt. Galt, the name Galt, it comes from the border dialects between England and Scotland, where nobody understands the word they're saying. But the word Galt means pig in the border dialects. I quoted in a book on British surnames. Um,
yeah,
so anyway, Conkling and Blaine. So that's why Grover Cleveland became president, because of a split in the Republican Party between the Blaine faction and the Conkling faction. And the only other time during those years that a Democrat got into the White House was Woodrow Wilson in 1912, and for the same reason,
yeah,
because split in the regular Republican vote, because William Howard Taft was the Republican nominee, and Teddy Roosevelt uh, just was bored being out of the White House, and he just had to get back in.
yeah,
And so he ran himself on the third party ticket called the Progressive Party, nicknamed the
yeah,
Bull Moose Party. And all he managed to do was to split the regular Republican vote and elect the Democrat Woodrow Wilson.
yeah,
So from the election of Lincoln in 1860 up until the election of FDR in 1932, those were the only two times that a Democrat got into the White House, and it was
yeah.
only because the Republicans split.
Well, the other thing too, Fred, you got to this too. Grant Hayes, uh, uh, I think Arthur and Grant Hayes, maybe Arthur, definitely Garfield, uh, Taft, and Harding, all from Ohio.
Yeah, Ohio became the mother of presidents, as Virginia had been
Yeah,
one time before that.
and then of course you have a guy named after a city in Ohio. Yes, I write. Yeah, Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, also I guess we got to talk a little bit about what was the deal with Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall.
Yeah, another quibble on terminology. People say Tammany Hall all the time. They mean the Society of Tammany, which began uh, in New York and Philadelphia after the Revolutionary War, after Evacuation Day, as a veterans group for enlisted men. The officers had their Order of the Cincinnati, uh, speaking of cities in Ohio, and the enlisted men had the Tammany Society or Columbian Order. They couldn't apparently make up their minds whether to call it one or the other, so they called it both. But then that club or Society for Enlisted Men in New York City became the first Democratic Party club. And then in the years from Evacuation Day, 1783, up through the 19th century, it came to be not the only Democratic club in New York City, but the dominant one. And the name Tammany became a byword for corruption. So much so that by 1945, after a century of this notoriety of the name, they finally just disbanded the club because apparently they found the name Tammany had become so odious that
Yeah.
it was a liability.
And yet also with the growth of New York, I think we ought to at least talk about one of the tragedies that occurred there in, I believe it was 1912, and I'm of course talking about the Triangle Fire.
1911.
1911. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Uh, what can we? What do I want to say about the triangle?
Well, they were all locked in and they couldn't leave the building. So
Yeah, one thing, well, I did read a book about that one time, years ago. Don't remember much about it, but I do remember being surprised to find that the workers in the Triangle Company were not employees. They were independent contractors. A lot of these immigrants came off the ship with their Singer sewing machine on their shoulder. They owned the sewing machine, and then
oh
they
wow.
as contract workers. And because of that, they were selling their finished products to companies like the Triangle Company, uh, and they were selling it by the piece. So this kind of work became known as piecework rather than employee work.
Yeah.
That's what they were. So they were not employees; they were independent contractors. And like everybody, they smoked cigarettes or cigars or something, and some idiot was smoking something in a room filled with highly flammable cotton or wool or whatever it is they were sewing. And the company had locked the door so that people couldn't sneak out for a smoke. So it was there's plenty of blame to go around.
Yeah.
The company can be blamed for locking the doors, the smoker can be blamed for smoking, and the fire department can be blamed for not being prepared for this sort of thing. The work was being done on a floor that was above the height of the highest ladders in the fire department. So everybody gets a share of the blame here.
And also believe, one time the Singer building was also at one time the tallest building in New York.
Yeah, the Triangle fire did not take place in the Singer building, but the
But
Singer
yeah, but
building,
Singer sewing machines because
Singer sewing machine, a very big company with a very important product that millions of people bought. My grandmother had a pedal powered, I think it was a Singer, it was a sewing machine, but you put your foot on the foot pedal and you rock it up and down, and that's what it turns the spindle or whatever it is that turns on a sewing machine. So yeah, the Singer Company was um, built a building on Broadway. The architect's name was Ernest Flagg, and so there was a big flag on top of the Singer Building. Uh, and that building was torn down for the U.S. Steel building, which, not surprisingly, is built to look like a giant erector set. It's advertising steel.
but
Uh,
but New York was starting to become the home of tall buildings, and of course the Empire State Building, and you just think of New York and you just think of all these great buildings. It's
yeah, and I still see the New York skyline and the image of the skyscraper used as a logo for companies of all kinds and a logo for New York City itself in tourism. even though New York City has long since lost its distinction as the home of the skyscraper. Now there are
Yeah.
skyscrapers by the thousands in cities all over the world, and now there are cities
Mhm.
that are bigger than New York. A friend of mine went to on a tour of China 5 or 10 years ago, and he said, I went to a city I had never heard of called Chengdu, and it's bigger than New York City. So skyscrapers are popping up all over.
Yes, they are. Just it's yeah, yeah. What was the when was the consolidation of New York City, and what was the purpose of that consolidation?
That was 1898. New York City, up until 1874, had consisted of Manhattan Island, which was also the county of New York.
New York, yes, which
Uh,
is also, I believe, the smallest county in America by land area,
well, it's the smallest county in New York State. I don't know about the United States, but certainly,
and also one of the most densely populated. But yes,
probably, yeah. There was a book about the Lower East Side in the days of the Triangle Fire. The book is called More Teeming Than Bombay, which is a good way of describing the Lower East Side.
yeah,
Immigrants in the tenements. There's a tenement museum on the Lower East Side. Uh, these tenements were filled with immigrants who would sleep in the same bed. They worked 3 shifts and they slept 3 shifts. So the bed never had a chance to get cold. One guy would get up and go to work, and somebody else would come in and sleep in the same bed until his shift came up 8 hours later. So extremely crowded. Uh, and let me see, what was your question?
I think I was talking about the consolidation of the city.
Oh, consolidation, right. That was 1898. The city of New York in 1874 absorbed the Bronx, and then they went to a two-borough system. Now, the Bronx had been a couple of townships of Westchester County up until that time, but now it was part of the city of Greater New York, 1874. But then they realized at the not only at the local level but at the state level, even that's not going to be enough. It's going to make more sense to consolidate all of the really built up and even some of the farmland into a really big city to be called the city of Greater New York. And so they put it to a vote. Uh, and the people of Richmond County, Staten Island, voted to become the borough of Staten Island in the city of Greater New York. But the people of Kings County voted to become the borough of Brooklyn. Now, that caused a lot of broken hearts because the city of Brooklyn rivaled New York City in size, and the advocates for the
Mhm,
independence of the city of Brooklyn argued that New York City already pretty much fills up its county, which is smaller. Our county is twice as big,
mhm,
and there's still lots of farmland here in Kings County for the city of Brooklyn to expand into and grow in, and therefore Brooklyn is going to end up being the dominant city anyway. So this new consolidated city should be called Brooklyn and not New York. Well, they did not prevail. Probably by a margin, the people of Kings County voted to become the city of New York. And as for Queens, Queens County included in those days what is now Nassau County, Long Island. And well, the people in the eastern townships voted not to become part of New York City. The people in the western townships voted to become a borough to be called Queens in New York City. So the eastern part became the new county of Nassau, and that and the county of Suffolk take up the rest of Long Island. So it became a city of 5 boroughs, each one of which was a major city in the United States in its own right. In the Civil War, Brooklyn was Mr. Lincoln's third largest city, and the
yeah,
fire of Brooklyn formed a unit, a regiment in the Union Army. And I don't know whose idea this was, but they got uniforms that were made in, I guess, made in France for the French uh, army in Morocco. Uh, that army were called the Zouaves, and so the firemen of Brooklyn became a regiment in the Union Army called the Brooklyn Fire Zouaves, and they saw action wearing their silly looking French,
yeah.
that is Moroccan or Algerian or whatever it was uniforms. So Brooklyn was a big, big city in those days, but it all became part of the city of Greater New York in
Well,
1800.
a lot of people in Brooklyn still think of Brooklyn as, as its own city, though. They won't say I'm from New York. They'll say I'm from Brooklyn.
Yes, it became, and some of those people went to Hollywood. A lot of people
Yeah.
in the New York area were among the pioneers of movies in Hollywood. And so in the 30s, 40s, 50s, uh, hardly a movie came out of Hollywood without a nostalgic reference to Brooklyn, always followed by a laugh. The name Brooklyn became an automatic laugh line in all the Hollywood movies of those decades.
And up until the 50s, you had the Brooklyn Dodgers, and now you have the Brooklyn Nets. And so it's still that way. I mean, there's no, yeah, it's,
Yeah, some old timers out in the boroughs are still saying I'm going into the city, meaning I'm going into Manhattan. Well, they're already in the city. Brooklyn and Queens are part of
yeah,
this, but they say I'm going into the city, and still it may have been changed in the 25 years since I lived in. Or I used to live near Avenue U and the D train. I'm not even sure it's the D train anymore. The D train stop on Avenue U. There are signs in that station that say to Coney Island or to the city on the D train on the Brighton line. Uh,
mhm,
you're not going south to Coney Island; you're going north to the city, meaning Manhattan.
exactly. So this also, can you tell us a little bit about, the famous Brooklyn Bridge, which was the first bridge, I guess, between Manhattan and Brooklyn?
Yeah, uh, yeah, that was the site of a ferry.
Mhm.
More than one ferry. There were a number of points on the East River and the Hudson River where ferries ran for hundreds of years. There's a very poetic page or two in the Fountainhead in Wren's uh, flashback to the childhood and youth of Hale Wynand, who's the newspaper publisher in the novel that based upon William Randolph Hearst. There's a very poetic passage about how he was, as a boy, a shoeshine boy on a ferry crossing between New York City and either Jersey City or Hoboken or someplace. Um,
Yeah.
the Brooklyn Bridge, that was a ferry. If you look at the map of Manhattan,
Mhm.
Brooklyn, on either side of the Brooklyn Bridge or either end of the Brooklyn Bridge would be Fulton Street. It's called Fulton Street in Manhattan, and there's another Fulton Street in Brooklyn because those were the two uh, streets in the city of New York and the city of Brooklyn that led to the ferry. And the ferry was a wind-driven or rowed boat for a couple hundred years, and then it was replaced by a steamboat. And so, in honor of Robert Fulton, the first developer of steamboats, both streets were called Fulton, which they led to the ferry. In Dutch times, there was a guy with a boat, and again, not a matter of free enterprise, but a matter of who you knew in the company and the Dutch government who could give you the privilege of having a monopoly on this particular ferry route. Some lucky rower got himself that privilege, and you had to go to him. And he'd be sitting in his boat waiting for customers, and he'd just all day long he'd be rowing back and forth from the city of New Amsterdam to the city of Breukelen. Uh, if you came down to the shore and the boatman was on the other shore, there was a horn that was a ram's horn or something hanging on a tree, and you would blow the ram's horn to summon the boatman from the other side of the East River and ferry you across. uh, and that's where the Brooklyn Bridge was built. And that same site was also the site of the great evacuation of General Washington's army from Kings County in the village of Brooklyn in 1776. That's a wonderful dramatic episode. The American army, a lot of it, was trapped on the Brooklyn side of the East River with the British army ready to attack. Uh, the Brits held off attacking for a couple of days. It was rainy. General Howe didn't feel like it. He was having too much fun with his mistress, or for whatever reason, who didn't attack the Americans in their lines of trenches on Brooklyn Heights. And so General Washington got Colonel John Glover and his Marblehead, Massachusetts fishermen to ferry the whole army and their cannon and their horses and their provisions and equipment all across East River overnight. 13,000 men in 9 hours. They were aided by fog. The British couldn't see them, and by the fact that the wind that night happened to be blowing down the East River from north to south, and that prevented the British ships in the harbor from sailing up into the East River. If they had done that, then the evacuation would not have been possible, and that would have been the end of General Washington and a large part of his army. They would have been captured on Brooklyn Heights. The Marblehead men ferried the whole army under absolute silence with muffled oars across, just rowing back and forth across the East River all night long, hour after hour, ferrying the whole army to safety, at least temporary safety in New York City on Manhattan Hall. And the last man off the shore of Brooklyn was General Washington.
Yeah, it's actually, as much as people talk about their buildings, you can also, really talk a lot about New York and its history of bridges. I mean, the Brooklyn Bridge, the Williamsburg Bridge, the George Washington Bridge, and the Verranos Narrows Bridge at one point were all the longest. At one point, each one of those bridges was the longest suspended bridge in the world. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, um, and thereby hangs the tale of the Roebling uh, family. John Roebling uh, and his son George Washington Roebling. John Roebling was from Germany, so when he was born, he was christened Johann Roebling. I found out something very strange about John Roebling. Before he left Germany, the man who advised him to go to America was none other than Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, one of Ayn Rand's pet peeves, and
Yeah, wow.
a big figure in philosophical history. But he's the one who said to John Roebling, "They need engineers in America. You should go there if you need a job. So go west, young man."
Yes, go west, young man. I guess, as far as, we talked about some families, but then, of course, eventually we have the rise of the Roosevelts. They've always been associated with New York.
Another Knickerbocker
Yeah,
family.
yeah, the name Dutch, yeah, which is Dutch for Field of Roses. What can you tell about those? I mean,
Yeah,
I always think the funniest thing about Theodore Roosevelt was they gave him the vice presidency because they wanted to get rid of him.
that I don't know about. Haven't studied that much.
Well, he was the governor of New York, and they wanted to get him out of that position so he could basically not be doing much of anything.
Yeah, I've heard that said about several governors of New York.
Yeah.
Put him in the vice presidency. My father told the story, and maybe he might have gotten this uh, from Uncle Jim Sherman. But the story is told of the mother who had two sons, and one of them went off to sea, and the other became vice president, and neither was ever heard from again. Uh, my father might have gotten that from his father, who might have gotten it from his Uncle Jim, who was vice president. James Schoolcraft Sherman was vice president under Taft. If you can imagine being under William Howard Taft, our
And
head president at 350 pounds. But Jim Sherman, um, I spoke about Henry J. Cookinham, my great grandfather. He ran for Congress unsuccessfully, but Jim Sherman was his brother in law and junior law partner, and he ran for that seat in Congress successfully and went back to Congress several times. He was also mayor of Utica at one point, and then he became vice president with Taft in 1904. And Jim Sherman died in office. That's the other strange thing about the election of 1912.
mhm.
Sherman died of kidney or liver failure or something uh, just a few days before the election of 1912, November of 1912. And so Butler, Butler Library, president of Columbia
Mhm.
University, something Butler, um, was asked to fill in for him so that they would have somebody on the ticket. But Jim Sherman's name was still on the ballot. The ballots had already been printed. It was already that close to election day. So a lot of people cast their vote for a dead man. And Jim Sherman was uh, uh, buried in Utica. I have a book from that time that was printed by the government printing office called Memorial Addresses on the Life and Character of James Schoolcraft Sherman, Vice President of the United States. There is a telegram of sympathy from the King of Siam and from governments all over the world on the death of the Vice President. But the President, William Howard Taft, that evening was at a banquet at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, um, very place where the British had had floating prisons. Decommissioned ships were used as prisons during the Revolutionary War. And now it was the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and President Taft was there at a banquet, and he was going to speak, but somebody came up to the head table of the banquet and handed him a note that said that up in Utica, Vice President Sherman has died. And the president said nothing, but when it came his turn to speak, he rose and said the vice president has died, and I move that we adjourn this dinner out of respect. And he got on a train to Utica and
Mhm.
attended the funeral.
Yeah. So what do you when did New York start to change in the 20th century? I mean, of course, America has also changed and rejected a lot of its revolutionary roots and become this massive welfare state. When did that start happening in New York? Was it sooner? I mean, I've heard,
Well,
for example, we've had public
FDR,
hospitals for a long time and things like that.
there was FDR's New Deal starting in 1933, but before that, there was Governor Al Smith, who did some things, and I don't remember what exactly they were. Got laws passed on the state level that were precursors to the New Deal on the federal level. But more than that, I can't remember. That's
I
kind of far away from the revolutionary era, which is my specialty.
Yeah, he's also because he was also from New York, and he was the first time we had a major I believe we had a Catholic run on a major presidential ticket too,
Yeah.
and that was still an issue. Oh, we can't vote for him because he's Catholic. Yeah, and of course, my goodness, Fred, we can certainly look, at how Columbia has just impacted American history and not for the better. I mean, with for all those Frankfurt School people coming to Columbia,
That's another thing I don't know much about.
Herbert Marcuse and and the Frankfurt School, the basically German communists who were fleeing the Nazis.
Mm. Well, Marcuse ended up in San Diego.
Yeah,
I know that, and Angela Davis was one of a comrade that they
yeah.
had, and it still is.
Mhm.
Yeah, Herbert Marcuse. When I went to Cortland State College, a choir from
Yeah.
Hungary came to entertain. And the next morning, I was in the college bookstore, and some student came in and said that he wanted a book on Marcuse or by Marcuse. And the bookstore manager said, "No, I'm all out. Those Hungarian singers, they bought every book of Marcuse's I had in stock."
Well, as you pointed out, New York became the center of publishing, then it became the media center,
Mm,
NBC, CBS, and TV stations and things like that.
mhm, mhm.
I guess it's not quite the way it used to be because there was certainly, you know, I'd say by the '70s, we probably had more TV and movies made in LA, but
Yeah, and part of the reason for that was the nicer weather in Southern California.
Mhm.
The fact that the film stock in those days wasn't as sensitive as it subsequently became. And so it was important for the early movie makers to be someplace where it's real sunny all the time,
Mm.
just because of the lack of sensitivity of the film. But also, if it starts raining or snowing, you got to stop filming. And so it
Yeah.
has to be in a place where it hardly ever rains and never snows. So the rush was on to Hollywood.
Yeah, it certainly is, but, still the networks have their headquarters there. I mean, ABC, CBS, NBC.
Yeah, and
It
because the the descent of finance from the shipping to insurance, insurance to banking, banking to stock exchanges. Wall Street and New York in general was where the money was. And so anybody in any business, no matter where their business was located around the country, after your company grew to a certain size, you would locate in New York. You would either bring your whole company headquarters to New York, or you, as the head of the company, the CEO, would move to New York and you would run your company by telegram. That's what they did in the days of Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. Um, uh, because you, as the head of the company, had to be here where the money men were on Wall Street in order to borrow money. So it wasn't just publishing, it was everything.
Yeah, it was everything. Yeah, it was, well, we certainly had some businesses prop up elsewhere. I mean, yeah. Well, I think we've covered just about everything on important about New York here. I as the country's become more obvious, I wanted to go for the older history, but been pretty amazing discussion here. Yeah, where can we find you out there?
What do you mean, my email or what?
Your web, you have a website or a Twitter account or
Yeah, I have a website. It's called indepthwalkingtours.com. In depth,
yeah, and you still have walking tours of New York City. Yes,
indepthwalkingtours.com.
yeah,
And
and so
find
okay,
all
that's
the information about my walking tours. I give 20 or 30 of them.
are these groups or just single people?
I'll take anybody. I'll do a tour for one person. I can do up to about 20 people. After that, it's hard to project to more than 20 people. But I do schedule tours, and I can arrange for a private tour at your convenience.
Fred, it's been great talking to you, and certainly New York has a lot of interesting stories. So please like this video, subscribe to the channel, go buy my novel Escape from the Village, turn on notifications, check out my Substack. People are giving me money at buymeacoffee.com. Thank you, Fred Cookingham. I'm Chris Baker. We're out. Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you.